Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on Shaka Live is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kavale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you today?
I wish I could say I'm hugely terrific, but unfortunately, my friend, I'm still working my way out of the cold.
Interesting. Let's pray for you. Hopefully, by the end of this segment, you'll be feeling fine.
I hope that I'm not violating anyone's constitution.
And a warm welcome to you, all our Facebook followers are watching us live from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to him and ask some pertinent questions, either from the content or all over the world. Shaka, let's get to it. Once again, we are talking about Kenya. The events happening in Kenya are interesting, so to speak.
Very interesting, but of course, the one very, very important document, the Kenyan Constitution, really, which was put in place in 2010, seems to be in a position where it could virtually be buried. And I'm talking about the actions of the Kenyan government led by President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta. He's obviously being criticized, for example, for having shut down the three, in fact, you might say 4 television channels in Kenya for a week. Not only that, you have a Miguna, a guy that some people love to hate, a guy that some people call very snobbish, and others call very intellectually very, very friendly. A guy who calls himself, in fact, a general of the NRA. An NRA, by the way, which is really different from that of Uganda, because the NRA in Uganda was an armed wing, or an armed struggle, so to speak. But in this particular case, you're talking about an NRA based on an idea, really. You can't prescribe an idea. It is an idea. It's just like saying you are either leftist or Marxist, or you are basically right of center and all that kind of stuff. And then you go back to President Kenyatta. He also is being criticized for the manner in which he appointed the cabinet. The cabinet, for example, some of his critics say that he introduced positions that constitutions, frankly, the constitution does not allow. We're talking about the constitutions that appear to be assistant, cabinet secretaries, so to speak, and one of them, of course, being a former member of parliament and Minister Ababu Namwamba. Then we're talking about also the fact that those particular appointments, frankly, do not, for example, factor in the constitutional requirement of making sure that the cabinet looks like Kenya in terms of regions. And the cabinet also, really, it has to have, I think, like a third of its members should be female. We're talking about gender equality or gender equity. He avoids that. So there are a lot of people who are saying, you wait, this man is playing, really with the document. That is very, very important. Now, when it comes to the manner in which he is, of course, reacting or dealing with Miguna, he seems, frankly, to forget that this is a man who a lot of people did not respect because they thought he was very intellectually snobbish and what have you. And now he has actually seemed to give him legitimacy to the extent that he's now viewed, in fact, by a lot of people as a hero. Miguna, in fact, could have a Mandela moment if you give him a platform. The fact that he's remarkably articulate. He seems to know his law. He seems to be very, very sophisticated sincerely. If you give him a platform in a court of law, I can see him reflecting a bit of young Nelson Mandela in the early 60s, the Rivonia trial.
I couldn't agree more, Shaka. Let's talk about what's at play. The last time I checked, at least when Raila Odinga was being sworn in, he didn't say he was swearing in as the President of the Republic of Kenya. He said he was swearing in as the President of the People's Republic of Kenya. There is a big distinction right there, right? So why are his supporters, why is, for example, the land fellow Dr. Miguna being tried for treason?
In fact, you raise a very, very interesting point, Paul. In fact, I have talked to people who claim to know their law very well, who have read the Kenyan Constitution and what have you, and that if you look at the manner in which Raila Amolo Odinga cited some of those words that you mentioned, that it will be practically or legally impossible, really, to be charged with any crime, including treason for that matter. And if in fact you can go after Miguna, a man obviously who says that he actually saw Raila Amolo Odinga on January 30th at Uhuru Park, then what about Raila Amolo Odinga? How come Raila Amolo Odinga is a very free man? How come they are not touching him? Is it because perhaps he is untouchable? Or is it because, in fact, if you touch him, you could actually trigger something that you cannot or may not, in fact, control? Such is the dilemma of Kenyan politics, because you are having two individuals here, very powerful individuals, sons of very historically, politically important figures. Two individuals, in fact, that would equally be regarded as the founding fathers of independence Kenya. You're talking about Jomo Kenyatta, who happens to be the father, of course, of Uhuru Kenyatta. You're talking also about Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who happens to be the father of Raila Odinga. As a matter of fact, there were some pundits who were saying, look, you have two individuals here. If there is such a thing as, the Kenyan kind of territory or some land called Kenya, these are two individuals, in fact, that probably co-own that Kenyan land title. And these pundits were saying, if you are going to, frankly, have Kenya going about normal business, what the president, meaning the one that is legal, even though he's perceived to be illegitimate, the man that occupies State House in Nairobi, Uhuru Kenyatta, should actually pick up a phone and call Raila Odinga so that they can actually meet, not only have some sort of exchange of social amenities, but in fact, seriously address the issues that are bringing the Kenyans apart. Because let's face it, there's only one Kenya. And frankly, they should both look at Kenya as something that is more important than their individual egos. And let's face it, there must be some very important problem here. And if the problem is there, the problem is not very difficult to identify, it must be addressed.
Shaka, I've been watching all the developments that are happening in Kenya and reading a lot of stuff on social media, including watching some of the protests that were taking place as of last week, over the weekend, yesterday, even earlier today. Most people seem to liken what is happening in Kenya to Uganda. Actually, when you look at the banners that are being posted all over the place, they're like, this is not Uganda. Is there a likelihood that Uhuru Kenyatta, the current president, has borrowed a leaf from his neighbor across the president of Uganda? Because we know for sure in Uganda, Besigye is the type of guy who they have thrown in jail over and over again for similar cases, being charged for treason and so on and so forth.
First of all, I think, yes, you could say that there seem to be some similarities, really, even though the two countries' constitutions are totally different. The constitution in Uganda virtually makes President Yoweri Museveni what you would call an imperial president.
Or absolute monarch.
Or absolute monarch, something, or a combination, in fact, of imperial presidency or presidential monarch and an absolute monarch, for that matter. So that, in fact, he has his fingers in everything. If, for example, he didn't like you, and you were due for a passport and what have you, he would immediately become the passport officer. If, for example, there was a problem at Makerere, and something had to be done, he would immediately become the vice chancellor of Makerere University, Kampala. If there was something wrong with agriculture and what have you, he would immediately take over the docket of agriculture. But not so in Kenya, because with the 2010 blueprint, really, which ushered in a new constitution in Kenya, it virtually stripped all these imperial aspects of a presidency, creating a lot of sources of power and all that kind of stuff, creating what they would call constitutional offices and what have you, to the extent that you really have a situation, ideally, that should really have institutions that reflect the issue of checks and balances, where you have, in fact, for example, a legislature that is independent and respected, where you have an independent judiciary that is respected and independent and not subordinate to the executive, which is headed by President Uhuru Kenyatta. But unfortunately, President Kenyatta, in his own actions so far, and some of his officials and what have you, they seem to be, in a sense, not respecting the Constitution, sort of mutilating the Constitution, which pretty much happened across the border, to the extent that sometimes there are people who say what you are looking at in Uganda is no longer a constitution, but rather a personal manifesto of Yoweri Museveni. And it seems to me that Uhuru Kenyatta seems to be borrowing some aspects of that from Uganda, especially given the manner in which he seems to be using the security forces, especially the Kenyan police, sincerely, which is supposed to be a Kenyan police service, meaning serving the people, but not a force that intimidates and punishes people. And it seems to me that right now, as we talk, given that Miguna, for example, was supposed to be released on Friday, there was even a bond paid for by equivalent of $500 US, 50,000 Kenya shillings. The police or the executive ignored that. They shut down again, like I said earlier, the three perhaps most important commercial television stations. We're talking about KTN, we're talking about National Media, Citizen, and look, for 7 days, he completely ignored that, except that by yesterday, he lifted a ban on KTN, which, by the way, is owned by the Moi family. KTN is part of the Standard Media Group, which are owned by majority shares, really, the Moi family. It could be probably even under a man called Senator Gideon Moi, who knows? And then you talk about Nation Television, whose majority owner is the Aga Khan, a man who also owns the very prestigious Serena hotels in Eastern Africa and beyond. But frankly, when you look at the board, and the chairman of the board is Mr. Chiboro, who happens to be a man from Central Province, the guy that was recently in charge of the operations, the chief executive officer, was also a guy from Central Province. And most senior journalists and managers really tend to be from Central Province. And so you could say probably these were platforms were politically favorable to the ruling party Jubilee. But even when you come to Citizen Television, which is under Royal Media, owned and operated by a gentleman by the name of S.K. Macharia, he also comes from Central Province, except that he happens to be fiercely politically independent-minded to the extent that he is perceived to be a supporter of NASA or Raila Odinga. And as a matter of fact, some time back, he was one of those people who actually testified before the Kenyan Senate, saying that the election of 2007 was won by none other than Raila Amolo Odinga, and certainly not Emilio Mwai Kibaki, the kid from Nyeri.
Yeah, Shaka, let's cross over to Southern Africa. Something is brewing in South Africa. As we speak, for the first time in a very long time, the president of South Africa, or the parliament, was suspended. They were supposed to have a State of the Union address. It didn't happen. What's going on in South Africa?
Very interesting. It looks like when we talk about the South African president, Jacob Zuma, better known by some of his very close associates as Mushorozi, he obviously seems to be between a political, kind of like a rock and a hard place. He obviously didn't get his way when he wanted his former wife, Dr. Dramani Zuma, to succeed him at Ruthuri House, which is the headquarters of the ruling ANC. Instead, it was his deputy president, Cyril Ramaphosa, a man who very much liked by a lot of people, incredibly smart and very rich. Is one of the richest, in fact, individuals in South Africa, courtesy of an ANC program that wanted to have some of their own people being rich. So he benefited out of the Black Empowerment project. And he was a man, by the way, who was largely the key guy who negotiated the end of apartheid. He's somebody that never lived in exile, someone that, if I remember correctly, was never probably even looked at Robben Island, someone who came from a background in Soweto, belonging to an ethnic community that is not one of those major social, political groups talk about. We're talking about a vendor who therefore was politically looked down upon. Despite that, the Madiba himself, Nelson Mandela, liked him so much, respected him so much, and saw the future of South Africa through Ramaphosa, to the extent that, in fact, he wanted Ramaphosa to succeed him in the presidency, because at that time Ramaphosa was the Secretary General of the ruling ANC. But unfortunately, because he was never in exile, and those people who came from exile, including, of course, Jacob Zuma, Thabo Mbeki, and the others, felt like they had a sense of entitlement. And so it was never to be. So he had to leave politics, go and make his money and become rich and what have you, and eventually he came back. It seems to be his turn, and he seems to be lobbying for his boss politically, Zuma, to step aside really, because he retains a lot of baggage. And given that you have an election around the corner, I'm talking about next year, they feel like they need to begin on a new chapter so that they can kind of like restore the integrity and the dignity of the ANC. So it's like a sort of political restore ANC legacy. But Zuma also seems to have other ideas. He seems to want to serve his term, which ends next year. Then he has also a problem with the judiciary system, obviously, because of alleged corruption and what have you.
Will he survive?
And he has the Guptas, the Indians that not only were getting a lot of tenders, but apparently also seem to have influence in terms of who became a minister and what have you. So Zuma really has the work cut out for him. The fact that Parliament postponed the essentially the national kind of like the sort of state national address means that he could actually be in huge trouble, because the last time I checked, he has actually summoned an emergency cabinet meeting. So we don't know exactly what he wants to talk to his cabinet or wants to get out of the cabinet.
Okay, let's go to the comments. Let's start in Accra, Ghana. Let's go to Johnny A. Ladson. Is Odinga undermining the Kenyan constitution for security reasons? Would it be prudent for Uhuru to arrest him in the future rather than now?
I don't know what kind of, I don't know how Odinga has undermined the constitution, because let's face it, the constitution of Kenya guarantees for example, that you can actually have freedom of assembly. And I think what you saw in Uhuru Park on January 30th was a reflection of that. And there are so many people, to the extent that people in fact are beginning to say it wasn't simply in thousands, rather it could have actually been 1 million plus. And by the way, most people agree that that kind of gathering has probably not happened in Kenya since the last time in 2000 when people went to Jomo Kenyatta International Airport to welcome the opposition leader at that time and a presidential candidate, Mwai Kibaki. And let's face it, when Uhuru Kenyatta was inaugurated in office last year, apparently, you know, when you compare and contrast with these people who came to Uhuru Park voluntarily, these were probably more than 10 times as many as those who actually went to celebrate Uhuru Kenyatta's inauguration in Kasarani Stadium.
There is a Facebook comment here who disagrees with you. He's called Eric Kioma. He says, there was no vote rigging in Kenya. The problem here is tribal. The power has been rotating between the big tribes. Rigging is only a scapegoat for Raila to take power through the back door. Your thoughts?
First of all, I don't know how he's disagreeing with me. Will disagree with me on what basis? Talking about which rigging? There is no question that the October 8th election was nullified due to illegalities and irregularities. And the people who came with that ruling was not Shaka. It was not Ndugu Shaka. On the contrary, it was the Kenyan Supreme Court which came up with that. And by the way, that was one of the world records that came out of Africa, because the last time I checked, there are only 4 countries in the world that have actually, that belong to that club. And Kenya happens to be the only country in Africa where an incumbent who allegedly had won an election found the election to be nullified. There is no question that in 2007, that election was rigged by the supporters of Mwai Kibaki. That is a fact. Even probably Kibaki himself wouldn't dispute that. And you remember the dramatic manner in which he was even sworn in at State House at night with almost nobody except the Chief Justice, who also happened to come from, at that time, Central Province. And the guys who were in charge of the military and what have you and stuff like that. I mean, come on. I mean, I was told, by the way, by a man who had to know what he was talking about. This was a man called Samuel Kivitu, a man who happened to be, at that time, the chairman of the Electoral Commission of Kenya, as it was called. He told me, in his words, that that election was rigged. And it was rigged in favor of a man called Kibaki, who apparently had actually been his lecturer at Makerere University College back in 1960, when this guy was doing the intermediate, the equivalent of HSC, before he went to be part of a pioneer class of law school at University College Dar es Salaam.
How about people who, for example, Sam Mugabe, he argues that the older Raila thinks that Kenya must conduct an election where he must be the winner. And that's totally wrong. Probably he's old and he has nothing to lose, but he should maybe leave the stage and give it to other young people.
You know, there is a saying that everybody is entitled to his or her own opinion, but certainly not the different sets of facts. That guy, I don't see what kind of evidence he has that Raila, in fact, has been losing elections. Raila, it is true, he has been a presidential candidate 4 times. 1997. That one, he lost. This is an election, by the way. Mwai Kibaki himself, who finished second, told me it had actually been rigged by then incumbent president, Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. Now, the following election, which was 2002, it was Raila who said Kibaki Tosha. And you know what happened? That is probably the only election since independence in 1963 that most pundits will agree was free, fair, transparent, verifiable, and credible. The only election, because the following election, 2007, it is also agreed that this was an election that was rigged by the Kibaki people. This is when the man was sworn in office at night. And you can be assured that he rigged the election, because if you had a man called Kiwi to tell you how a man called John Michuki, at the time who was the Minister of Internal Security, actually threatened to withdraw guards if he could not hand them a certificate of victory and all that kind of stuff, you'll just laugh. Then 2013, on the surface, the election seems to have actually been won by Uhuru Kenyatta. And in fact, subsequently, the Supreme Court of Kenya, which was led by Chief Justice William Mutunga, seems to have endorsed it. But later, I have been told again by some of these people who were involved how, in fact, the reality was different. The election was rigged. Then you have this last election, 2017. And you know what happened on August 8th. And then you also know what happened on October 26th. And you know what happened even the day before the election, in fact, was held on October 26th, which is considered by some as a coronation of Uhuru Kenyatta, because they saw Uhuru running against Kenyatta himself. You're talking about a situation, my brother, here, where the Supreme Court was supposed to have a forum to decide whether or not they should proceed with the election. But guess what happened to the driver and slash bodyguard of the Deputy Chief Justice? They shot him.
Yeah, Shaka, what are you talking about tomorrow?
Well, tomorrow, of course, we're going to look at nothing other than, of course, the latest political developments in Kenya. And so we'll be looking at the people's president, Raila Odinga. To a certain degree, there are people who say, look, this may be a political rebel, but perhaps this time around, a political rebel with a cause.
We have less than a minute. Any final thoughts? Do you think Raila and Uhuru need to sit down and talk?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt, I think, in fact, they should have talked yesterday. If they were listening to me and watching me really, I think they should put aside their personal egos and make sure that, let's face it, Kenya, their motherland, their fatherland, is above their personal and political interests. These are very important leaders who represent very equally important constituencies. They need to provide leadership to their people so that Kenya, once again, frankly, can be a beacon of hope in the region. It's a great country and has great potential.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Shaka. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
You're most welcome.
And to you, all our viewers on Facebook, thank you so much for sending us those comments. And we look forward to talking to you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time next week. Bye for now.